Hello everyone and welcome back to the next video in the series for the rebuild of the Gardner 2LW and its Hunslet gearbox. In the last video we finished tearing down the engine, so this video is going to be a little bit different, not engine related. It's going to be dismantling this gearbox. Now for those of you who haven't seen one of these before, this is a Hunslet 2-speed gearbox from a rail loco. Sorry if I'm a bit croaky, I've not been very well the last few days, but hopefully you can still hear what I'm saying. So with the engine now all dismantled, we'll start taking a look at this. There's a few things I've spotted already that are going to need addressing. This is the input gear that engages into the clutch plate, and I think you can probably just about see that it's quite heavily worn on the side of the teeth, so this is going to need replacing. The bearing as well is partially seized. Now this here operates the arms on the clutch pressure plate, and you can see there's quite a worn area here, so this is going to need a new one machining. And then the other thing we've noticed is, if you look at this sprocket here, which is one of the two outputs from the gearbox for the drive chains, you can see the sprocket is quite heavily worn. The one on the other side has been replaced at some point and is in much better condition than that one. And you'll also notice there's supposed to be circlips here which are missing on both sides. So anyway, we'll get straight into it and start getting it taken to pieces. So the first thing we're going to do is check over the clutch that was removed from the engine. Now this is the back of the pressure plate assembly. So this clutch plate sits in here between it and the front plate. Now the back plate here, although not looking great, this surface isn't bad. There's no big ruts in it, it's just a bit dirty, so that should clean up quite well, and along with the rest of it. You can see there's some fairly heavily worn areas here, and here, and here. Now this is where the clutch pressure plate adjustment bolts run, so we'll need to repair that damage, but that's relatively easy to deal with. And we'll move on to the clutch plate itself. Now, we would reline this anyway, but with the wear that was on the input gear to the gearbox, we need to check this on that gear on one of the unworn areas, because I expect to find that this spline here is actually worn as well. So we'll do that now. So trying to do this one-handed, so hopefully it won't be too jumpy. Now this is the spline in the actual clutch friction plate. And this is the gear it goes on. Now, as I just showed you, it's quite worn on the sides, but what we'll do is we'll slot it over one of the unworn areas and see how much play there is as to whether the spline on the friction plate is worn as well. And it's not horrendous, but there is quite a bit of wear there. I think you can see the gaps. So I think what we'll end up having to do is make a new friction plate and get that lined rather than reusing this one, because even with a new gear on the gearbox, there's still going to be quite a bit of play there. Anyway, let's move on to the outer plate of the clutch assembly, because there's quite a bit to do there. Now this is the outer plate of the clutch assembly. The friction plate I was just showing you is sandwiched between this and the back plate next to it there. Now this side of this assembly is a little bit worn. You can feel a little bit of wear where the clutch plate runs, but nothing horrendous, so this can be cleaned up, the face, and that'll be good. But to operate this clutch are these arms. Now these are bolted in like that, and these pins that I showed you earlier on poke up through these holes, and this is your adjustment bolt. And then the clutch release bearing portion, which is this here, is what operates it. So a lever in behind that pushes that like that towards the engine, which on those levers releases the clutch. Now, there's a bit of work to do here, because like the clutch release bearing, which is quite badly worn, the ends of these forks are worn. Not horrendously worn, so this one would be serviceable, but this is the only one we've got that is any good. So this one's a complete assembly. There is one assembly completely missing. I'll need to check with the owners as to whether they've got that one and have kept it. But then when this was being removed at the railway, this arm got broken. So obviously this arm has got a section of it missing there, and the pivot that it acts on has also been broken. So we may have to make two complete assemblies, and obviously for a set I would suggest that we probably do that one as well. So anyway, now we've checked over the clutch, which is going to need some work, we'll start on the gearbox. So I think the first thing we're going to do is remove this lever here, just so it doesn't stick out quite so much when it's removed. There's bolts for it there, and we'll get the side plates off the side here, with an aim to get the lid off the top of the gearbox. So we'll get on and do that first. Okay, so very quickly in, we've run into the first problem. The screws that hold this handle on, this one's come undone, but you could see in the past it's been quite heavily over tightened, so it's all necked, so that'll need to be replaced. And then the other one, the thread is damaged right on the end, so it won't come off. So we'll get that removed. Nope, doesn't want to come off, that one. There we go. Yeah, that's in a pretty bad shape as well, so we'll replace both of those. Well, okay, well we won't be removing this, because although we've got the bolts out, someone has actually welded the handle onto the gearbox. So for now that will stay there, and we'll speak to the owners whether they want this to be removed properly and bolted back on like it would have been originally or not. Different bolt, that one. And that one's different as well. So a couple of odd sized bolts. There we go, that's the first side plate off. Oh, certainly doesn't smell very nice inside. There we go, that's the other side plate off. Yeah, it smells pretty bad. So, next thing we'll do is get these bolts around the lid undone, and around the input shaft on this end of the gearbox, and then hopefully we can get the top off. Oh, and say no circlips, that's just pull off this side. Okay, so that's the bolts holding the lid on out. So we'll now take the ones out around the input shaft this end. Okay, so I think it's now time for us to lift the top off the gearbox and take a look inside. Here we are with the top lifted off the gearbox. So these gearboxes are quite simple. There's two selectors. There's this one here, which is your forward and reverse selector. And then there's another selector down there. I think you can just about see the shiny area where the fork runs. And that selects your two speeds. So depending on which you require is either over to the left or over to the right. Now, the input on this gearbox from the engine would be turning this anti-clockwise, so like this. Because the engine is anti-clockwise rotation. And if we were to select that direction, you could see the gears are rotating this way. If I was to select the other way, you can see they start rotating the other way with the same input direction. Similarly with the lower selector, if I stick it into one of the two, that's how fast the output turns. If I swap it to the other one, you see with the same input speed it's considerably faster. So anyway, with that done, we'll get the input shaft out and get that stripped down, and then we could go further down into the gearbox. First things I note is on the selector here, there's quite a few burrs on the end of it, so it's obviously been crunched in and out of gear in the past, both sides, so at least that will need dressing if not replacing. And there's also quite a bit of float in these gears, meaning there's quite a lot of play in the mesh between the input shaft and the gears, so we'll probably have to correct that a bit when we put the gearbox back together again. So we'll press the bearing and the gear off the end of the input shaft. So here we are with all the components of the input shaft all stripped down. Need to check the gear, but in general the actual shaft itself doesn't look too bad. This is the main bearing that sits just here. This one isn't too bad. There doesn't appear to be a lot of play in it, but it'll get replaced anyway. Now this is supposed to be the circlip that holds this bearing in. This was actually loose and floating up and down the shaft, so that will need replacing. The groove that it sits in is okay, but it's obviously popped out. Now this is the release bearing assembly. I mentioned wear on it earlier on. There it is there. So that half will need to be remade. This side there's a little tiny bit of wear on it, but probably not enough to warrant replacing it. But the bearing internally that sits inside this is actually completely fallen to pieces. The inner ball bearing cage is actually broke in half and fallen to pieces, so you can see there's one half of it, there's the other half, so that'll need replacing. Bearing would have got replaced anyway, but it definitely needs replacing. Now I may be wrong, and I'm sure someone will correct me in the comments. It's a long time since I have seen inside one of these. I'm pretty certain a felt seal is supposed to be in there. There appears to be a little tiny bit of it around this side, but in general it's missing, so that'll need a replacement seal. This is just a washer, that's fine. This is the input gear that we touched on earlier on, which has got some quite bad wear on it, so that'll need dealing with. And also this is the support bearing for this end of the shaft, which actually runs within the pressure plate of the clutch, and it's for all I could do to get that to turn, so this is virtually seized up. So this is an open bearing, and there's no way of greasing it, so we will replace this with a sealed bearing, which hopefully will mean it will survive a bit longer in the environment it operates in. So anyway, this can all go in the wash, and then we'll move on. So we'll now lift the input shaft out, if we could get it out. Might need to give it a bit of persuasion. Okay, so we'll now lift this shaft out. Hopefully it will come out without too much aggravation. Yep. There you go. That cover off. Okay, with the output shaft out, we've managed to pull out a couple of the gears. First thing to note on this one is a lump of tooth missing that's been missing for some time by the looks of it. There's a bit of wear where the gear sits on, so the bushings are a bit worn inside. And then earlier on I was mentioning the wear on the selector forks, and you can see here there's quite a bit of burring on these. So we'll get the last gear out the gearbox and then take a look. So this is the low range output gear, or first gear. As per all the other gears, the bush is quite worn in the centre, and other than that the teeth all look good. But it's also had quite a bit of end float, because you can see it's actually been rubbing on the housing of the gearbox here. I'll try and show you where it's been rubbing. You can see this area here. So that's going to need correcting. But again, other than the bush, the rest of the gear is fine. So let's move on to the lay shaft. So after another quick session on the press, this is the lay shaft assembly to bits that carries the forward reverse gear selector. And these are the two gears that mesh with the input shaft. Now, both of these look pretty good. There's quite a bit of wear on the bush bore, which is allowing the gear to do this on the shafts, on the bearing areas. Now, although this looks quite scored, you can't actually feel any marks on them, but they are ever so slightly worn undersize. So this will need polishing at least here and here, and bushes making to fit those properly. We also, earlier in the video, you noticed that they were pushing away and together when fitted in the gearbox, and that is because there is a bit of wear on this face here on both gears, and that runs on the backs of the bearings, and you can also see there's a little tiny bit of wear here, so we'll need to correct that as well before the gearbox can go back together again. But the two main areas of concern in this on this part of the gearbox is firstly the selector forks here. Now we have got it out and can see a bit closer. You can see it is quite heavily worn, and there is wear on the sides of the teeth as well, not just the burrs that I mentioned earlier. It's not going to affect the operation of the gearbox once we've got rid of the burrs, but I'll have to talk to the owner of the gearbox as to whether they want to have this replaced so it's as close to as new as possible, or whether they are happy to live with this as it is. As I say, it's not going to affect how the gearbox goes in and out of gear. It's just there is wear there. But the biggest problem on this shaft is this gear here. Now, this is the gear that meshes with the one that I mentioned earlier in the video had a tooth missing. And the gear, actually, in general, all looks pretty good until you get to this tooth here. Now, I don't know if you're going to be able to see this on camera, but the tooth is cracked. So this gear and the gear it mates with, which has a partially tooth missing, are going to need replacing. So anyway, that's the lay shaft pieces. So we'll now move on to the output shaft of the gearbox. So here we are with the output shaft. Now, earlier in the video you would have seen me pull this out of the gearbox, and it still had this sprocket, this and the bearing that sits here in place. That's because, unlike this one, which pulled off in my hand pretty much at the beginning of the video, all did not go to plan with trying to get this one off. So we have a puller which can do about 10 tons. That wouldn't move it. It also defeated our press, which is a 20-ton press. It moved about a quarter of an inch and then wouldn't come off. So I've had to scour the immediate area around us for somebody who's got a press bigger than 20 tons. And luckily we managed to find a company down the road who has a 60-ton press, who managed to press this off for us. So now this sprocket and this sprocket are next to each other. You can see just how worn this one on the left is. So this one needs replacing. This one has a little bit of wear on it, but it's definitely still serviceable, so I doubt we'll replace this one. But another thing of note is this is one of the sleeves that go round this, that should be there to keep the oil in, except so although it's got some grooves cut in it, it's got no form of seal. So that'll be allowing a certain amount of oil to pass out of it, that one. But you can see the one at the other end has got this recess rebaited into it, and this actually had a seal in it. So we will probably obviously reseal this end and modify this one to take a lip seal, the same as the other one, so that we can hopefully get the gearbox as oil tight as possible when it goes back together again. So with this all to pieces, that is us now done with dismantling the gearbox. I hope you've enjoyed watching the video, something a little bit different. We'll be coming back to this once we've had some parts arrive, and obviously with the gearbox, discussions with the owners as to how far they want to go, whether it's a repair or overhaul to as close to new as possible. We're waiting on parts for the engine at the moment, so join us in the next video, which will be on one of the other projects that's going on at the moment. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed watching this video, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you for watching, and see you next time.